October 13th, 2025. I lost sight in my right eye, the first of 4 times. Each time it took about 15 minutes for my vision to return. This story has a long and winding history that I'll necessarily condense in this video because the specifics are less important for most Golden Years hiking viewers than a larger lesson, and it does tie in with hiking. I'm starting this story in the middle because with unusual medical events, that's how we experience them. They may seem to come without warning, but they usually don't come without a cause. So I was delayed in getting to the hospital that first time, and when I arrived at the emergency room, there wasn't much to find. At this point, many of you will be shouting at the screen, "Well, you had a stroke." And of course, that's the first thing any ER department assumes when a patient shows up with, "I went blind in one eye," without any more detail. It's a proper working assumption. I squeezed a lot of fingers over the next few hours. Scans were done, blood was drawn, eye tests were given, but nothing was found. I was sent home with instructions to return immediately if it recurred. I had none of the other traditional signs of stroke, no drooping face, aphasia, balance problems, or weakness. So 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time I got to the ER within a few minutes of my sight returning. I was admitted overnight and received a more comprehensive set of tests, CTA, sonograms of eyeballs, MRI, ECGs. Again, all negative. I mentioned some recent activity I'd done that I thought was pertinent, and while the doctors listened politely, they dismissed it as interesting but probably not relevant. The blindness episodes were preceded by blue blobs and flashes and a pixelation effect in my visual field, all in the right eye. I'd experienced similar disturbances the month before, and they seemed like migraines to me. A little unusual, but they cleared up when I lay down in a darkened room. As the first event was resolving, white and silver surfaces glowed and shimmered blue before my vision returned to normal. For the other 3 episodes, my vision returned over a minute or two with my right eye seeing a black and white negative image of the scene I was looking at. During recovery, I could see things perfectly well through my left eye, but could only make out outlines through the other. Now, I've had to leave out a lot of details and discussions in what follows, or this would be a 2-hour documentary, but here are the highlights. Cardiologist told me, your images all came back normal with some minor findings that are perfectly normal for your age. Ignore them. You have high LDL and it's causing microdamage that no test can detect. She then gave me a secondary prevention LDL target to get to. Later, when it came up that I get migraines, she prescribed sumatriptan. Now, this medicine is contraindicated for patients with cardiovascular conditions like strokes or transient ischemic attacks, TIAs, which at that point was the consensus opinion of what was going on. So, did she suspect a stroke or not? Well, not if she's giving me sumatriptan for migraines unless she's trying to kill me. She also ordered a heart monitor for me to wear for the next 2 weeks. More about that in a moment. Later, an ophthalmologist told me, "Your eyes are perfectly normal. You obviously had a stroke." He then went on to check the arteries feeding the eyes and added, "Well, that's good. There's no sign of blockages or plaque buildup. Anyway, you had a stroke." The neurologist I saw said he had no ideas and asked why I came to see him. At least he didn't suggest I had a stroke without further evidence. I wore that heart monitor for the next 2 weeks, and it seemed like there weren't going to be any more episodes. But on day 14, the 3rd episode occurred. Now, this was good news, bad news story. The bad news was that it happened again. The good news was that there was now heart monitor data during an episode. Had it been even 6 hours later, it would not have been recorded, and the 2 weeks of heart data would have been useless. I sent the monitor back to the lab, and I waited for the results. And I waited. And I waited. Finally, after several weeks of trying to find a report, my primary physician discovered that the cardiologist had it and had shelved it as uninteresting. A 67-year-old with an absolutely clean heart, no arrhythmia, no ventricular ectopy, no pauses, no skipped beats, no fibrillation, heart rate ranging from 39 beats per minute while asleep up to 157 during high-intensity interval training. This was a classic dog that didn't bark. The report listed the primary indication as cardiac arrhythmia, unspecified. That's not what they found. That's what the doctor was legitimately looking for. The no finding eliminated that cause and apparently all her interest in my case. I had a 4th and final episode on November 19th. Then over the next 2 months, I had 7 more traditional migraines with the aura before they stopped also. It's now been 8 months since the last blindness episode. Now, if you've never seen a migraine aura, it looks something like this. It's unmistakable, and it shows up in both eyes at once because it's happening in the visual cortex, not in the eye itself. I got them regularly until maybe my mid-50s. So what do I have? An obvious stroke, despite no evidence, according to one doctor. High LDL, according to another. True but irrelevant. Basically, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning from the neurologist. The ER personnel did their job quite well, but they also could give no answer. Now let's look at some context. I said I started this story in the middle, so what's the beginning? It's the thing I mentioned that got considered and rejected. In late August, I started my hike of the John Muir Trail. Now this presented me with a bunch of physical challenges that were new to me. 90% of the miles were higher than I had ever hiked before. Atmospheric pressure and oxygen content ranged from 75% down to 58% of sea level where I live. I had a close call with hypothermia. I inhaled wildfire smoke off and on for several days. I didn't sleep well in freezing cold nights. And twice, I descended rapidly from high elevations, from 12,000 feet to 4,000 feet in about 3 hours on September 12th, and from the peak of Mount Whitney, that's almost half the elevation of Mount Everest, to sea level in about 20 hours on September 16th and 17th. During that first descent, I experienced a cognitive aura, a feeling of disassociation from my surroundings. Now, I was worried I was going to have a transient global amnesia episode like I had 3 years ago. Fortunately, the feeling passed after half an hour. Of course, like anyone else nowadays, I did my own investigation. I can't say you did your own research or you're frowned upon. And I found some journal papers on a condition called high altitude deacclimatization syndrome, or HADAS. This is a little study phenomenon, and there are a few papers on it, and every time I thought I found a new case study, it turned out to be one of the two I'd already come across. HADAS occurs when you're acclimated to higher elevations, then descend rapidly without deacclimating. Some of the symptoms described in the papers match fairly close to what I experienced. Now, I knew to build up elevation slowly to get accustomed to the thinner air, but descending, it rarely attracts attention, but it's 72% increase in oxygen and atmospheric pressure going from Mount Whitney, that's the highest point in the contiguous 48 United States, to sea level. It doesn't matter for most people, and apparently it may for me. Now, the neurologist didn't outright reject this idea, he just admitted no knowledge in the area. On the east coast of the U.S., high-altitude effects are not seen very often. I was convinced I had the answer, but there was a problem that kept nagging at me. The effects of HADAS are loosely defined. The term syndrome is used to capture a wide range of symptoms. It's more of a label and a shortcut to quickly convey to a doctor what they're dealing with in coarse terms, like think metabolic syndrome. My symptoms went on for several months afterwards. The HADAS papers I found did report symptoms lingering for up to 90 days after returning to sea level, but that was among soldiers who had been at elevation for an entire year, not just 25 days. After a while, I just couldn't defend this hypothesis any longer. It was convenient and would explain a lot, but I was force-fitting my experience into the description. A neat and tidy explanation that's wrong is still wrong. That's why it's dangerous for a patient to diagnose themselves. But the reality is, doctors don't have all the answers either. It requires collaboration between the patient and the doctors. Now, in the United States, the medical system is set up for two broad situations: treating emergencies and treating chronic or short-term illness. There's really no place for an unusual case that disappears and leaves no trace when the only data is the patient's subjective experience. The neurologist in particular had exactly zero intellectual interest in my case. He couldn't give me a diagnosis, so he literally recommended take baby aspirin daily. At no time did I get to present a timeline, which is even more detailed than I've discussed here. Where I reconstructed it from the hike, I was carrying a tracker that reports the rapid descents accurately to within 10 minutes and a few feet of elevation and position. Rarely does a patient come as prepared with the data that I had. We just never got that far. The short appointments give no time for deep dives. There's no reward for a specialist with a full slate of hundreds of patients and months-long waiting lists to spend any extra time on what may be an intractable problem that I will never see again. This isn't a criticism of individual doctors. It's the system we're in. A major event for me, it's just an odd hiccup for them. So why should this matter to you? Well, if you're in your 60s or 70s and still hiking, you're not typical of your peers. You're not coming in with a couch potato lifestyle. The cardiologist had never come across a patient with a 50-year history of high LDL with no systemic atherosclerosis. That was outside her experience. Her recommendation for me to reduce my LDL to secondary prevention levels was not only unwarranted for me as an individual, I didn't fit the criteria for secondary prevention at all. That's known cardiovascular disease or a prior cardiovascular event. The ophthalmologist could see the lack of evidence and still not let go of his initial reaction that it was a stroke. I suspect that few or none of you viewing this video will have this exact experience, and if you do, don't assume it's the same thing that I had. But when you present with unusual symptoms, you must push back when you're getting easy pattern match answers that ignore a lot of the factors. Many treatments that may be appropriate for couch potatoes, such as cholesterol-lowering drugs, may not only be inappropriate for you, they could interfere with your ability to hike at all. That's not true for everyone, but it is for some of us, and it's certainly true for me. So what's the final diagnosis? Well, there really isn't one. The best I have is this statement from a sports medicine doctor I see regularly. Amaurosis fugax, that means blindness in one eye, I guess, consistent with retinal migraine or retinal vasospasm triggered by high-altitude hiking and related bodily stresses. Consistent with is the key phrase here. It's not a full diagnosis. That's just not possible at this point. Retinal migraines are rare enough that there's understandable hesitation on the part of doctors to pin it down more definitively without direct evidence, and most have never heard of it. The stresses were hypoxia, which is low oxygen, hypothermia, low body temperature, smoke inhalation, sleep disruption from the cold nights, mild dehydration, and an extreme calorie deficit for 25 days. I was running 2,800 calories per day short of what I was using. Now, though he led with the caveat, I'm not able to diagnose, of course, the night shift nurse at the hospital suspected a vasospasm. Sometimes the enlisted man in the field knows more than the officers giving the orders. Well, you notice I've spoken about migraines a lot today, yet neither I nor any of the specialists initially made that connection. Each was narrowly focused on their specialty areas, and they couldn't think outside their domain. I was so fixated on the high-altitude hike as being the cause rather than just a trigger for a prior susceptibility that I fixated on HADAS, which was an unnecessary complication. Maybe being a syndrome, HADAS is defined broadly enough to include my case, but at this point, it really doesn't matter. So what will I do? Well, unless one of these blindness events occurs again, totally disassociated from a high-altitude hike, I'm going to assume that's the cause. I'm avoiding those hikes in the future. Now, I've declined an invitation from a lifelong friend to hike the Colorado Trail. I've gone my whole life never hiking at higher elevations than 7,300 feet. That's slower than what we experience on a commercial cross-country flight with the cabin pressure. Mount Whitney is nearly twice that, almost 1.5 miles higher. That's substantially different. It's a minor restriction, but it reflects what I've been talking about since this channel started. As older hikers, we need to respect our limitations. We embrace them as challenges to be faced, but not ignored. Some age-related restrictions can be overcome through lifestyle adjustments and training. For some, like this one for me, I'm better off acknowledging it and avoiding what causes it. The specific limitation applies to me, but most likely not to you. My hiking partner on a JMT trip is exactly my age, and he had no lingering problems at all. So to summarize, when you're faced with unusual medical conditions, respect your limitations. Understand the limitations of our medical system. Understand that you may not be typical, and your doctors may be treating your peers instead of you, a population instead of an individual. Nobody cares about your condition like you do, and nobody knows what you're experiencing like you do. You may tell your doctors, I hike daily, or I hike long distances, and they may hear, patient walks a lot. You deserve a better understanding of your conditions. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this or other topics you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, please take a look at it now. Thanks for watching.